Agnès Poirier, welcome in my home office.
Thank you for having me in your home office.
It's a great pleasure to see you, to meet you. You are in Paris, I'm in Stuttgart. You have written a book about Paris and about the generation born between 1905 and 1930 who experienced a brilliant awakening in Paris after 1944. The war was over after the liberation in August 1944. The German occupiers had left and the intellectual life regained the upper hand. Above all, Jean-Paul Sartre, not only with the Temps moderne and Albert Camus, set the themes and founded existentialism. Everything was highly political. People were looking for a new model of society between the two big camps, communism and capitalism, perhaps a third way. You wrote a book with the English title Left Bank, Art, Passion and the Rebirth of Paris, 1940 to 1950, who had been translated by Monika Köpfer for Klett-Cotta. It appeared 2 years ago. You have presented an exciting narrative about the magic years of Paris, 1940 to 1950. Why did you choose this particular period? It goes from the beginning of the Drôle de Guerre to the post-war period.
Well, originally, it was not exactly the dates I had chosen. I had chosen 1945 to 1955. And when I started researching, I researched for quite a long time. And I went back in time because I wanted to understand what had happened before and then before that. And actually it went back to the 1920s. And then I was ready to start writing. But I thought, I cannot possibly start in 44 or 45. Mm-hmm. I need to explain the 4 or 5 years before, because otherwise you can't understand a thing. You can't understand all those people. You can't understand how they feel and how they behave and what they think at the time. So I talked to my agent and to my publishers in New York and in London. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but it's going to be 1939 to 1949. Because I said, just at the beginning, I've got a few words saying you cannot understand the elation of the liberation of Paris in 44 if you haven't stared in the eye the absolute despair. And not only the despair, but actually the 50 shades of grey of Nazi occupation and also resistance and collaboration. And it was, those years really where we sort of, the years of training and also completely shaped the 30 odd characters of this book. I'm talking about characters, but there are obviously people who lived, real characters. So that's the reason why in the end I chose 39 to 49.
When your book came out, I take your plan of your book and I made a long walk across Paris, and I have taken photos of all the places mentioned by you in the 5 and 6 arrondissement. I would like to ask you, which are the most exciting places for you in these 2 quarters of the town?
Oh, every single one of them, really, because they all tell different stories.
Really?
And because a lot of them are still here. So it's, I'll tell you just one, a few things. It's not exactly an address. It's on Boulevard Saint-Michel. And I do write about it in the book. Is there is a whole walls just by the Luxembourg Gardens. And those walls are riddled with bullet impacts of the liberation of Paris. Mm-hmm. And it is so moving each time I pass it, and I don't do that all the time, but very often I need to actually touch that wall, because suddenly, it's like a porthole into another time, which is actually yesterday. When you think about it, it's very recent history. But the fact that the bullets impacts are still there for everyone to see, and children, you have to tell children about it, because and Paris is like this. Every corner, you can go back much further in time. There's a trace, a trace of the French Revolution, a trace. There are ghosts in the street of Paris everywhere, whether it's Voltaire or Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, or Olympe de Gouges, who was a feminist during the French Revolution. So that's the beauty of Paris.
Mm-hmm. It is not possible to ask you who are the most important intellectuals in this period, but because they are all very, very important, and it's difficult to make a rank between them. But for you, who are the most important at the time?
Well, I mean, if you are talking in terms of just facts,
Mm-hmm.
and the production of books, of thesis, of the importance of of translation and their importance and influence. Obviously, Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir are in the top. But at the time, Paris was such a laboratory of ideas, and you have people who actually were stars and very, very influential at the time, and have sort of been slightly forgotten today, and are worthy of being rediscovered by students today, or by anyone really interested in that period. I'm thinking about Arthur Koestler, who, of course, was a writer star in the 50s, but very few people actually read him again. And his earlier works are superb still. Norman Mailer is another one, of course, is still a very well-known figure, but perhaps not for the things he should be remembered for. And Richard Wright is a brilliant Black American writer, or Nelson Algren, for instance, and they are sort of forgotten. I mean, slightly forgotten, depends, of course, who you talk to, but they are not at, the far front of literature or politics, and they all deserve to be rediscovered. And also some, Ellsworth Kelly, for instance, the American painter, and many others I talk about in the book. So I wanted some very well-known names still now, but I also wanted my hope was for readers to actually, after reading Left Bank, to go and investigate and go and find those books and discover those voices.
Mm-hmm. And the rebirth of intellectual life in the 50s, in the 5th arrondissement around the Sorbonne and the 6th arrondissement around the Church of Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris, led to a cultural redefinition that affected all areas of life. Jean-Paul Sartre was in the thick of it and had already set the tone in 1943, given with more than 700 pages, in which the philosopher set out the foundations of human freedom in the midst of the German occupation. But his lecture 1946 of l'existentialisme et un humanisme became the manifesto of existentialism and shaped an entire generation. Was Sartre capable to form the period of his time, or does he even reflect what happened in Paris?
Well, he stayed in Paris during the war, during the occupation. He was made prisoner of war. He escaped the prisoners' camp, went back to Paris in 1941, and that completely changed him, because he always thought about himself as a writer. He wanted to be the new Flaubert, really. He didn't want to really become what he would become. And also he thought that philosophers and writers were above politics. He was not really interested in politics until the Second World War, struck him. and so he told Simone de Beauvoir, and he said, we must, start our own resistance movement. And they did. And for a few months, they tried to galvanize, and they cycled to the so-called free zone in the south of France and tried to contact people. But there was a problem. They wanted to resist and to fight with words, which is fine, but there was a war, and a lot of their friends wanted to fight with guns and with explosives. And so in the end, they kept to their words by resisting, at least staying in Paris, and he continued to teach philosophy at the lycée. But of course, after the war, he was not considered as a great resistant because he hadn't really taken physical risks like Albert Camus did. Mm-hmm. But still, it completely affected how he thought, also Simone de Beauvoir, in the sense they thought nobody can remain passive, nobody is above politics, we need to be engaged, as we say, engagé in French, a committed public intellectual, and we can't just remain, in the realm of ideas. Philosophers need to be also combatant, and hence his, existentialism, which that's how his philosophy is known. Although he never liked the word existentialism, it was more a sort of morale de l'engagement. But he had a great gift. His gift was with words, and his thinking was very clear. I remember as 17-year-old student in Terminale at the lycée, philosophy is compulsory, and we were made to read Platon, of course, but also his existentialisme et un humanisme conference of the time. And it is so clear. It's also very short, but it could speak to somebody like me, to my generation, who were born, almost 40 years after he wrote it. And the fact that, to choose to remain passive in politics is also a choice, and nothing happens by chance, and you're responsible for your actions and your life. Not, pretending not to be interested in politics is actually a political choice and a political act.
Thank you very much. We make now the link from these years of which you describe in your book, between 40 and 52 our days, and I will invite you to my conference in the Sorbonne in September, next September, for the colloque of the Groupe d'études Sartrienne about Sartre.
Very good. I'll be there.
Albert Camus also belonged to the existentialist circles around the Church of Saint-Germain. Which was his relationship with Sartre?
Well, I mean, he was younger than Sartre, and he looked up to Sartre and to Beauvoir. And there was a profound friendship at the beginning, and profound admiration, actually. And, it's a bit like with Arthur Koestler. They tried so much to find this third way, and they failed, and they parted because they had to take sides. You needed to take sides, either because they hadn't managed to create that third way between, let's say, American capitalism and communism with Russia, and Camus really saw himself as a social democrat, and he didn't want to have anything to do with the communists. He also didn't want to have anything to do with the right-wing Gaullist, and perhaps luckily for him and for his legacy, he died very young, so he didn't make any of the mistakes that Sartre did afterwards. So in a way, in our memories, is quite pure. But Sartre really fought very hard, and actually something that is very little known. He actually founded a political party in the late 40s, and it lasted what it lasted. That is to say, about 18 months. But Sartre founded a political party, the RDR, Rassemblement Démocratique et Révolutionnaire. And of course, today we would think it's a bit naive. It's like saying the Revolutionary Center, for instance. There's a sort of contradiction in terms. But what he wanted to do was really, to find a way which was non-communist left, and also something that wouldn't pay lip service to American capitalism, let's call it that way. He wanted also, there was something quite novel at the heart of his manifesto, was the independence of Europe. And that's interesting. Mm-hmm. But it didn't live for a very long time. There was much interest at the beginning, and I guess he was more of a public intellectual than a politician. And the results of the elections were, not good enough, and they just, they closed the shop.
Mm-hmm. And the occupation of Paris on the 14th June of 1940 marked the beginning of a 4-year-long martyrdom of the city, many intellectuals leaving before or shortly after. Sartre was arrested and taken to Trier. In early April 1941, Simone de Beauvoir found a note under her hotel room door: "I'm at the Café of the Trois Mousquetaires." Sartre had managed to escape, was back in Paris. He took more than 3 years until liberation, but somehow intellectual life went on, and intellectual life was the best defense against this German occupation. Isn't it so?
Yes, well, it depends how you look at it, of course, because, Pablo Picasso could have left Paris. He was very well known, and he had friends all over the world, in South America, for instance, who said, come to us, don't stay in occupied Europe. And he chose to stay, and he was forbidden from exhibiting his work. So it was it was not a resistance, but you can argue that the fact that he stayed and lived through the hardship of the occupation and continued to create and to paint and not being able to exhibit was an act of resistance somehow.
Yes. And also for Sartre, when he wrote more than 750 pages about human liberty, it's also an act of resistance, I think.
Of course, and there are so many different ways to react to occupation and also to fight it. They were not taking as many physical risks than others. It goes without saying. And of course, a lot of publishing houses, for instance, decided they didn't want to have anything to do with occupied France by Nazi Germany, and decided to close down. Some others, like Gallimard, decided to continue. And the way it operated was a bit strange, because on one hand, it published some appalling collaborationist fiction and non-fiction, but they also contributed and published, Louis Aragon and many other resistant writers. And within the Gallimard offices, you had the in-house resistant, Jean Paulhan, who had resistance underground activities, and the friend of Nazi Germany in the office next door. And one knew what the others was doing, and they somehow cohabitated. So this is a very strange period, and I didn't want to pass any judgment. I thought, I stuck to the facts, and readers are far too intelligent to be told what to think. It's for them to decide, what side they choose and what they hope they would have done in similar circumstances. But it's quite astonishing. The occupied Paris was, such an astonishing place to be. Very frightening, but also in some ways very stimulating. Sartre said something: we were never freer than during the occupation. Of course, it was taken badly years later. It depends what you put behind his words, but I understand what I think he said. At least you could be free in your head. That's one thing. And perhaps because you were confronted with real choices. We're not used to those choices anymore, because in Europe we're very lucky to have lived, in peace. So cultural, to answer your question, cultural life continued. And I came across this very, very ambiguous and fascinating character, who is Gerhard Heller, who was this very young man who was given, he was barely 30, and he was given the responsibility as a German officer to supervise the whole cultural life, or at least the publishing life in France. And he allowed, because he had to do his job, obviously, but he was a lover of literature, and he was a real Francophile. And he allowed, for instance, The Outsider by Albert Camus and a few other plays to be performed or to be published. When actually, and he told his superiors, no, they are not about freedom. They are not, resistance literature. No, it's nothing to do with this. And he allowed for the amount of, because that was his role as well, to allow paper to be given to the publishers so they could publish the books. So, it's really not a story of black and white.
You gave already a very, very fine, very good answer of my next question. Not everyone had to come to terms with the occupiers. There were many forms, such as resistance, going out, hiding, or some form of coming on terms with the occupiers. Choosing a side is a heading on a section of your book. And on August of 1944, the uprising in Paris began. And on 25 August, the city was liberated. In the third chapter, The Struggle Life on a Knife's Edge, you bring to life all the drama and the longing for the end of the war.
Yes, there was, in the last few months, they knew something was going to happen. And there was this, something had to give. And it was both very frightening and very scary, but very stimulating. We're talking about very young people, very talented, people. The characters I'm following during those years, and there was an excitement. At some point, Albert Camus had to go into hiding because a lot of people were being arrested. And also in Paris in June and July and August 1944, the American and British aviation were bombarding and killing a lot of people because they needed to do what they were doing. And Sartre, wrote a long article that was published in for the British and the Americans, saying, we saw your planes and we knew you were going to liberate us, but it meant that hundreds of us had to also die under your bombs, and we needed to love you so much to be able to endure this as well. I mean, this is such a very special moment. And when the Americans and the Free French and the Allies come come into Paris at the end of August 1944, a lot of American GIs, it moved them so much that some of them had to come back, on the GI Bill. Years later, because American GIs were given the GI Bill was a very generous system by which all those young men who fought could then go and study in Europe if they wanted to, and they had some money, and they had to do was enroll at the Sorbonne University, and many did this because the liberation of Paris had meant so much for them.
There's another dimension of the cultural history after and post-war period. What role, for example, did the American Richard Wright play?
Yes, well, Richard Wright is again a fascinating character. He was a very well known and cherished Black American writer, very successful in America in the 40s. But there was, racial segregation, the fact that he had success. He lived in Brooklyn, in New York. He belonged to really the American middle class and the American Black middle class, and he tried to help a lot of his young and impoverished fellow Black writers. But he was also married to a white American of Russian and Jewish origin, and somehow he didn't feel at home in America anymore. In his diary, he says, I need to leave America. There was a growing resentment against segregation. And like a lot of American artists, Black American artists, whether jazz musicians or writers, he decided to come to Europe and to Paris with his family. He had a 3-year-old daughter. And also, his application, it took him more than a year to get his visa to Europe, because in his youth he had been a communist. And although he was not a communist anymore, American authorities were quite wary of seeing him go and perhaps, fomenting some sort of unrest in Paris and being bad publicity for the American government. So they didn't really want to let him go. In the end, they relented. And he writes, he's on board the ship with his family, finally. And he says, the moment I saw, the Statue of Liberty in my bag, I felt so much better. So his resentment was such that actually, putting the ocean between him and America was what he needed at the time. And he absolutely loved the first few years of his time in Paris because, he said it very, very simply. In America, I was Black. In Europe, in Paris, I was American. I was a fat, rich American man. Also, it was, perfect timing for him because his first 3 novels had just been translated into French for Gallimard and Albin Michel, The Native Son, Uncle Tom's Children, and Black Boy. He had befriended Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. So he was straight away embraced and championed by the left bank intellectuals, and he was invited everywhere. And it was extremely liberating for him, just to be here.
If the readers of your book use a map in your book to find all the important meeting points of the protagonists in your book and the 56th and 6th arrondissement in Paris, they will get a whole new picture of the city. In this sense, you present an exciting literary history in which you names and classify important titles of well-known novels and plays. Which books should the traveler to Paris take with him for a preparation?
Well,
2 titles.
2 titles. You mean the Paris of the time?
Yes,
or
yes, yes,
yeah.
yes.
Well, I would say, although it's not about Paris, but it's about life in France,
Yes.
as seen by a great writer. I would say The Scum of the Earth by Arthur Koestler.
Yeah.
And I would say probably The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir, because it reads incredibly well, because she writes so well, and you think it's going to be, because it's such a fat book, you will think, oh,
it's also very modern for our times, isn't it so?
Yes, completely. And you might be worried, thinking, oh, it's going to be too intellectual or too obscure or too detailed, and actually it reads like a thriller.
Yes,
it's extraordinary how it reads so well. So those 2 books, but there are many others.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the visit in my home office.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.